The Oregon Ducks have landed another big-time prospect, and there's a lot of discussion about the quarterback dominoes that are going to fall. That is right now here on The Portal.
Locked On presents The Portal, the daily podcast covering college football recruiting and everything NIL. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network. Your team every day.
Welcome back into The Portal. I am your host, Brian Smith, longtime college football recruiting analyst and writer. Thank you for making The Portal your first listen each and every day as we break down all the latest happenings in the recruiting, NIL, and transfer portal world. And right now, we're going to talk about the latest commitment for the Ducks. We got another big-time player from across the country going to play for Dan Lanning, and we also have quarterback dominoes and more recruiting news. And to help me break it all down, just like every Wednesday, my guy, John Garcia Jr., thank you, sir, for stopping by. What is it about Dan Lanning and his crew, man? What's the deal? They just seem to get guys just randomly all over the United States.
Yeah, I think randomly is a good word. We knew Xavier Lherisse was high on Oregon. He had said a few official visits, Oregon, Florida State, etc. So we knew the Ducks were in it. He's been there before and has spoken incredibly high of the program, but you still expect him to get to that point, get to the visit window before a decision comes down. But, they say if you know, and he's felt like a priority there with the Ducks for a long time. And I think it starts there. We could talk uniforms, NIL, Big Ten, being number one last year. All those things matter, absolutely. But I think at the end of the day, these recruits are case by case. And the head coaches especially who really hit the ground running and put that work in, it matters. It matters to these recruits, especially now in a day and age of more and more coaches on staff, deeper recruiting staffs than we've ever seen. Right now, there's GM position, player personnel, high school relations. There are 50 different titles beyond the on-field staff that are really recruiting focused. So with all of that, it creates a diluted pool of who's talking to me. Well, with this school, I hear from the personnel guy. In this school, I hear from my position coach, maybe a coordinator. But when it's the head coach, we see this at Miami, Georgia, Oregon, certainly with Dan Lanning. When it's the head coach, despite all those other bodies who could occupy that time, I think it just means that much more. So I think this is classic Oregon, Dan Lanning at work here, building up a big group already, 10 verbal commitments. And you understand why these kids early in the process are very much lenient towards even going across the country to a school like Oregon. I think they've been building this 26 class since 2023. What was their first verbal commitment in this class. So it's not anything new for the Ducks. The destination, not as surprising. Maybe the timing is, but the destination, not very surprising for really one of the more intriguing prospects in the country.
He still has a possibility of taking OVs like anybody else. And right before this, he had walked in Oregon, obviously, but Notre Dame, Auburn, and Florida State. So, again, he's a national guy. I'm not sure what's going to happen with that, but I'm sure that there will be efforts made because punt return guy, he could play nickel corner, he could play outside corner, he could play maybe some safety, probably could play offense if you wanted him to. He was a really good receiver last year for Eau Gallie. When you get kids like that, if you're Lanning, you got to be happy because he can be put in a lot of different roles. I guarantee he'll play special teams right away in Eugene too. Don't undervalue that. It's a very important part of this game. Finally, on him, I just like to watch his film. I haven't seen him live, but his film's just good. If you want to be entertained today, go check out Xavier Lherisse on Hyde. It's sure. Legit. John and I talked about that earlier today. Some kids are just really fun to watch. And when you get a kid like that, that's also something, and Lanning's smart with this. He will sell that to other recruits. You want to be a great player? We'll play with other great players. I know I would. So, right. John, any final thoughts on Mr. Lherisse?
Yeah, just an all-around athlete, three-sport guy. So, one, you're not going to see at a bunch of camps and 7-on-7s because he's playing basketball. He's playing baseball in the offseason. So you understand the hand-eye coordination, and that has translated to production. Lherisse has plucked 15 interceptions over the last 2 seasons. And like you mentioned, great on offense with the ball in his hands. Several pick sixes, several return touchdowns, and offensively, 9 receiving touchdowns as a moonlight guy last year for Eau Gallie, who's got a bunch of FBS type talent on their roster. So they're not lenient on him on offense, but he's so talented. You just got to get him involved in some way, shape, or form. 5'10", 185 pounds or so. So he's not going to blow you away from a measurable standpoint, not a lot of verified times. So he's not for everyone in the evaluation business, but in terms of just pure athlete, instincts, ball skills, pure football player, Lherisse brings a lot to the table, and that's why we like him as a nickel. We think he's a guy, number 7 nickel in the country at Rivals. We think he's a guy who can line up inside and absolutely support the run with speed to power. He can contain as a true safety, play the alley, but he's so special in coverage that you almost want him working underneath, so where he can occupy multiple zones and maybe compensate for maybe a slow-footed linebacker and just sort of own an area, because he is so savvy and so instinctive, and he can flat out run. I think that's the other part of this. Oregon is predicated on speed, whether it's going back to Chip Kelly, through different coaches, Cristobal, all the way to Dan Lanning. It's predicated on speed. Even in the Big Ten, Oregon wants to be known for that juice. And this kid brings it. I don't care if he doesn't have a verified time. Watch the tape. He plays great competition on the East Coast in the state of Florida, and he's been dominant on multiple, all 3 phases, really. So I think there's not enough to be said about Lherisse. And this is a big get out of Florida. Like you said, Florida State, Notre Dame, very much interested in this kid. So we'll see about the visits. He told me he's going to, enjoy the commitment and reassess that as we get a little bit closer to June, which is incredibly understandable. But you understand why not only, Oregon wants to lock him in early, but other schools are like, hey, congratulations on the Ducks, but, make sure we can get those 48 hours on our campus.
Absolutely. And sticking with the Ducks, a guy that I have a feeling that we'll be talking about a lot, Mr. Quarterback, if you wanted to put a picture next to what a guy's supposed to look like coming out of high school if you were going to get a 5-star, Jared Curtis. We've talked about him a little bit before, but I want to do this from a broader perspective. Oregon and Georgia, barring something unforeseen, are the finalists. His decision, whether it's the Ducks or the Dogs, impacts numerous other players. A guy like Ryder Lyons in particular, who you could argue those are the 2 best quarterbacks in the country, and they're both looking at Oregon very hard as an example. We'll talk about Ryder here in a second. What do you like about Curtis? And then afterwards, how do you see this unfolding once he makes his decision for both schools?
Well, you mentioned it, B. It's the prototypical skills. I mean, big, physical, confident kid who knows he's got the arm talent to make teams better. He doesn't play at an IMG or a Modern Day where he is just surrounded by blue chip talent. So he kind of is the full engine that allows Nashville Christian to go. So, that spotlight and real pressure, I think, has molded him into a very confident thrower all over the field. Any throw you want. I mean, this is the type of guy that, we're in NFL combine season, right? Pro day season. This is the type of guy that you watch his pro day and you're like, holy crap, he can do anything you want as a ball distributor. Put it anywhere you need, anywhere on the field. What did they say? Touch every blade of grass on the field that you could possibly need. So from a pure arm talent perspective, maybe the best quarterback in this class, but maybe with the least, level of competition and supporting cast of all these elite guys. You mentioned Lyons, Faison Branded, Landon Duckworth, whoever it is. So he's a fascinating evaluation, but you understand why everybody still wants this kid. One-time Georgia commitment, and now he's down to Georgia and Oregon. And Oregon's got a lot of buzz going into this one. So maybe he's the prospect that vaults Oregon from the number 2 class right now on Rivals up to number 1 if he jumps in with a commitment. But as you would understand, a huge domino and a guy that when he decides, regardless of which school is the pick, it's going to affect a lot of programs and a lot of players at the position. So a true alpha in many senses, and it's going to have that same type of impact on the recruiting trail.
Well, just so people know, I believe it's the 8th through the 12th for Oregon for an unofficial, then right after 13th to the 16th, if I remember right, John. And those 4-day windows could solidify for one of the schools, maybe make it harder, but we do expect him to take his OBs May, June. I don't know what the dates are, and those could change anyway. But unless something changes, again, it's those 2. So as it talks about, or we talk about Ryder Lyons, we're going to get into that next here on the portal, but Jared Curtis could be the most important domino, really, of anybody left on the board on any position or any school, because once he commits, it changes it for a lot of other schools. When we come back, we're going to talk about the dominoes at the quarterback position. When the game tips off, the NBA action is just getting started, and there's no better place to get in on it than FanDuel, America's #1 sportsbook. With FanDuel, you can place live bets throughout the game, so even if you miss the opening tip-off or want to bet on a fourth quarter comeback, you can stay in on the action. And if you're looking for a bigger payout, you can even combine your live with the same game parlay. Here's an example. If you're going down the stretch of a game and you see a team making a comeback and you want to make a bet right there in the fourth quarter, you are more than welcome to do so. FanDuel makes it very easy. Right now, new FanDuel customers can bet $150 in bonus bets if your first $5 bet wins. Just go to FanDuel.com to join today. That's FanDuel.com for your shot at $150 in bonus bets. Make every moment more with FanDuel, the official sports betting partner of the NBA. John, Ryder Lyons is a fascinating recruit as well at the quarterback position. I was messaging with him the other day. I didn't know this. He was 200, 205 pounds last year when we saw him at Under Armour in Miami. He'd flown across country to go to that one. He's up to 225. So I didn't know that until I was like, oh, I just thought he was going to say 210, something like that. He's 225. So he's put on the muscle and he's put in the time. He's a kid out of Folsom, California. That's northern. It's not that far from Sacramento, but he's seen a lot of competition, and he's a kid that's not afraid of it. He was tremendous, as you and I discussed the other day, when he was at Under Armour. If you want a quarterback's film, going to get some pretty good comp. That's good, and he's dynamic. Here's another kid. You go find the huddle film for Ryder Lyons. Accuracy, athlete, like he can move, extend a play, or he'll take off on RPO if you give him an alley. He's happy to take that yardage and go right into the end zone. So what do you think? Do you think he will try to jump in? Because now Jonas, he's flipped to Southern Cal from Oregon. This is such a weird dynamic. He's a Chicago kid, committed to Oregon, flips to USC. You got Ryder Lyons in Northern California. The Ducks and the Trojans have been the talk, but the Trojans, I don't think they're going to take a second quarterback. Maybe I'm wrong. If Oregon's not available, like if Curtis jumped on the boat and has said to heck with it on his visit here in a couple of weeks, what happens with Ryder Lyons? What have you heard, and how does that impact other quarterbacks around the nation?
A whole lot of personnel departments will be mobilized all in one motion if Jared Curtis picks the Ducks. Because like you said, for Ryder Lyons, we talked about Xavier Lyrisse's tape. If you want to watch a fun quarterback tape, it is Ryder Lyons. Running, throwing, off script, the whole deal, it's in there. Now he's bigger and stronger, which is even more fascinating to think about. But if Curtis picks the Ducks, thus blocking his path to his top two schools now with Jonas Williams flipping from Oregon to USC, yeah, all bets are off. And this becomes a true, not only national recruitment, but still one of the more fascinating ones overall, because Lyons is dynamic. He might not be a fit for every scheme, and he's also going to go on an LDS mission for about a year. So you're banking on a guy who is getting bigger, faster, stronger, and putting up this unbelievable tape, who will then take a year off before entering your collegiate program to then compete with whoever's in the quarterback room at that point. So it's a true long-term play for these schools. But I think with the names you see associated with Ryder Lyons, there's not one school that's too very much worried about the mission that he's going to take following his senior season there at Folsom High School. So yeah, USC, Oregon, the long-term top two really for like a year, it felt like. Now maybe both of those options are off the table. So take a step back, and here we go. BYU is absolutely going to be involved. You expect Utah, Ole Miss, and Lane Kiffin always in the market for a dynamic quarterback. I think they're going to get involved. And what about some of these schools that haven't landed their guy? We just mentioned Jared Curtis, right? If he picks Oregon, well, Georgia's SOL at the position. So do they circle back to a Ryder Lyons? What about Florida State, which lost Brady Smigel's verbal commitment just at the end of January? There's a lot of schools that could use that type of player. And there's a lot of big name schools that don't yet have that class of 2026 quarterback on board. So what I imagine happens, let's say Curtis picks the Ducks and blocks the path there for Lyons, I think he takes a real step back. I think he says, hey, whoever's interested, call me, and I got to take a bunch of visits. I really got to dig in and see what some of these campuses look like, because he's not as well traveled, because this top two of USC and Oregon was locked in for the last 12 months, maybe even longer. So I think this truly resets his recruitment if Curtis makes an early pledge to Oregon, which as of this recording seems like the most likely scenario. So fascinating to have a 5-star guy blocked at two schools, his top two schools, to have the possibility of swooping in and being plucked by another program. We don't see that very often, especially with a California guy, as you mentioned. Usually those spots are occupied pretty quick, and you sort of move on from there. But this is the opposite end of that scenario. So to have this type of talent maybe reset things in the spring going into his senior year, that's a great position for programs that are still looking for their 26 QB. But no doubt some have already put those dominoes together and extended phone calls his way. As we mentioned, BYU, Ole Miss in particular, I think are two that he's already built some familiarity with. So I think the ball will be in their proverbial court. But I think because of the renewed interest that will inevitably come his way, it's going to have him slow down and really think about taking a large slate of official visits in April, May, and June.
And it's interesting you brought up, well, what if Georgia loses the Jared Curtis sweepstakes? Okay, there's Duckworth, who you and I both know. We saw him recently at the Atlanta Combine, but that's no lock. Florida State, there's Georgia. It's Ole Miss is. Anytime Lane is involved with the quarterback, if I'm another school, I'm a little iffy. You can like him, dislike him, whatever, but he can coach quarterbacks. I think that's a pretty fair assessment, and you're not going to negative recruit him in that and win that battle. You just got to out-recruit him in general. So got to watch out for them. I think Ryder Lyons could end up anywhere. A school like Michigan or something could be involved. Anybody could be, because his list might change some. I'm curious, though, with some of the other schools that are waiting on a few kids. They want to go to one of these schools and probably aren't going to. It'll go just wide open right after this decision for Curtis and our Lyons. There'll be a bunch of commitments. That's just the way this works every year. It's why we always call it the quarterback domino. And it's kind of fun to follow. To that point, when you get a quarterback early, especially if you get like one of your top two guys, it really helps a class. Explain to people why getting the guy early, and you can pick whichever school you want if you want to use an example, is so important.
Well, look, there are restrictive rules for coaches in recruiting, whether you're on field or off the field, whether it's contact visits, just how much time and resources you can spend on recruiting they're limited, right? Every stage of the year and the cycle has very clear parameters, yes and no's, do's and don'ts that you have to adhere by. Well, for peer recruiting, so enter quarterback with anyone else that the school is targeting, and heck, the school could feed them the information, totally legal there. There are no rules. There are no restrictions. We saw this, I think, really create an impact during COVID, right? Where everything was shut down. So these kids that were committed to these schools, these quarterbacks really helped as much as ever before build the current recruiting class. Caleb Williams at Oklahoma, which is now weird to say, Miller Moss at USC. I mean, these guys were building classes, from the ground up and trying to organize, hey, we can't go officially visit and spend time with the coaches, but let's all fly to Norman, June 8th or whatever it is. And we'll just kind of make our own visit and we'll go see the facility and we'll try to, gain some access and talk and try to create fellowship around this school. That was an extreme example of it with Caleb and the Sooners, who had a great class, of course, that year under Lincoln Riley. But that's really what a lot of programs aspire to. It's why you see quarterback offers starting in 8th grade, 7th grade now for some of these guys. The schools want to get the QB on board relative to his class as early as possible, because he is not only the de facto leader as the future potential face of the program, he is the communications leader. All those group chats, all these Snapchat, whatever it is, the quarterback is leading that charge. And oftentimes his communication with the coaching staff allows not only the quarterback, but the rest of that commitment group to prioritize and hit up some of these guys. Hey, maybe we just lost a cornerback. Well, this guy's the next one on the board. I heard it from the head coach. Let's all hit him up and see what he's doing and let him know we really want him at our school. And I think what people don't realize with peer recruiting and why it's so important is that those are the only other people on the planet who understand what these kids are going through. They're in the same exact situation, going through the same exact process at the same exact time. So when you hear those approaches from your peers, who you sometimes respect just as much as some of the adults in the room, that stuff can shift things in quite a hurry. It's why every year at these all-star games or these big events, we see a lot of changes to the list of favorites for elite recruits. It's because they're playing with and against college players that that are recruiting them. Hey, come to Auburn, come to Oregon, come to Oklahoma, whatever it is. And they're in the locker room with them. They're hanging out with them at the hotels, and they're going out to eat with them, whatever it is. That stuff matters because those people are in your exact same situation. So it resonates more than most coaches could even aspire to.
Yeah, it's really important. I remember some of those. LSU had some of those visits with everybody just showed
Aaron
up.
Nussmeier, yep.
Yeah, I mean, it was wild. They had like everybody. Like that was brilliant. So quarterback dominoes, they are very, very important. When we come back, we're going to talk about one of the best offensive linemen in the country, his impending decision, and there's been a big coaching move by the University of Texas. That is next here on The Portal. Interior offensive linemen, John, they just get no love. They just get no love. But if you ask defensive linemen how much they like having a 325-pound man slam into them all day, I can guarantee you there's a different perspective on why they're valuable. Bear McWhorter is a kid that you and I saw recently. Plays at Cass High School in Georgia, just a little bit north of Atlanta. Really good football player. He won MVP by the Under Armour group for the O-line. He's one of the better offensive linemen in the Deep South. South Carolina is trying to make a run. It sounds like Bama, but there's several schools involved. Tell everybody what you like about Bear and why you think it's an important get to get dominant linemen like this in your program.
Yeah, Bear's going to come off the board February 29th. So depending on when you hear this, he might have already jumped on board with his future program. But yeah, it's a national race. I mean, I think that stresses the importance of the trenches. He's a big kid, as you mentioned, in the interior, 6'4" or so, well over 300 pounds, a guy who probably could occupy either guard spot, maybe a right tackle spot as well. So there's versatility. He's got a ton of experience. He's played multiple positions already. So a lot of the things that you look for up front, Bear McWhorter checks those boxes. And look, his name is Bear. I mean, his name is Bear. He's in the Deep South. Come on. This is a blue chipper, no-brainer type of prospect to go after. And that's why, it's Alabama, Michigan, Clemson, South Carolina, as you mentioned, and Arkansas had him verbally committed earlier in his recruiting process. So this is a no-doubter SEC Big Ten type of guy. And when you talk about the trenches and those two conferences, that's really where football begins. I think that the last few national titles have reemphasized that. It starts on the interior and on up front, and that's exactly where Bear McWhorter plays. So yeah, it's not flashy as a Jared Curtis, a 5-star type quarterback, but it's a very important prospect in general and a position group that we're seeing with increased value. Tackles have always gotten the love along the offensive line, but your centers and your guards, your interior guys are starting to creep up these draft boards. I mean, look at the last few years. Programs or NFL programs are doubling down up front, and you really want to build through the draft there. So I think the position has always been important, but it's reemphasized now, especially as we talk about potentially the return of the running back and the running game. These guys have even more added value immediately. So I think Bear's a guy who, is close to his ceiling already. I think he's versatile. He's got a great punch, a great understanding of leverage. He can anchor. I like his redirectional ability as well. He's got long enough arms on the inside, to occupy different types of players. He can go toe-to-toe with your old school nose guard, and he can contend with a 265-pound quicker than fast guy. And we saw a lot of that over the last few years at various camps where he has been one of the better linemen just about every time that he showed up. And again, when you're talking about doing that against Atlanta and Alabama and the Carolinas, that type of competition week in, week out, year in, year out, that consistency is much more revealing than it could be in other areas of the country. So I'm a big fan of Bear, 4-star guy for us at Rivals. Again, not going to be the flashy commitment for somebody, but those coaching staffs that are vying for him are very much pushing, and he's been a priority for such a long time for a lot of schools. Part of the reason why, he told us he wants to come off the board now. He's ready. He's been through the process. He knows where he wants to be. So that'll be a big one on February 29th.
I think Bear is a really good football player, and I wish him the best wherever he goes. Moving on, but staying in the same general area because they're at least now in the SEC. The University of Texas has got Duane Akina coming back. He was there 20 years ago, give or take. He was a really good DB coach. He's coming back. We talk a lot about relationships in recruiting. It's usually, not always, but usually the reason a kid will pick a school. Yeah, the logo is important. I know fans root for the logo. Kids pick coaches far more often than they do the logo. It's just reality. What do you think about the ability to coach? Because obviously Texas is not hurting for any talent at any spot, to be quite frank. When you evaluate hiring a coach, how much would you, if you were a GM, a head coach, okay, this guy's proven, he's got a track record, how much would you put emphasis on his recruiting acumen compared to on-field coaching?
Yeah, I think you'll probably get a different level of priority with every person you talk to, right?
Yep.
I mean, 50-50 is, I guess, the starting point there, because look, it's any coach will tell you from Belichick to Saban to whoever you ask. I mean, it's about the players, right? I mean, it's about bringing in talent. Talent acquisition is the most important element to coaching, especially at the collegiate level. So recruiting maybe 51-49 relative to coaching. But when you talk about when you are Texas and when you are that perennial playoff team like they've become, the separators now become the coaching, right? Because everybody's got, look, Texas, Ohio State, Penn State, Notre Dame, Georgia. I mean, these teams, Oregon, the talent level you're splitting hairs between all of them at most positions. So what are the separators? It's the scheme. It's the ability to adjust. And a lot of that comes from experience. And the new Texas hire has decades of experience at different levels. And that's something that cannot be taught. Again, we just talked about it with the linemen. Football is very cyclical, right? The spread era is still very much here, and that's still the forefront of what everybody wants to do. But the NFL just taught us, hey, running the ball and defending the run is still very much paramount. And you go to college football, well, heck, Ohio State ran that thing pretty well too. 2 years ago, Michigan, Natty ran that thing very well too. I mean, there is Georgia before that. Plenty of great running backs and running game. That stuff comes back around. So you think of a guy who was, maybe ahead of his time from a schematic standpoint in the secondary, but also very comfortable with that principle of, hey, we got to defend the run first. So I think some of those guys are able to come back around in this era and hit the ground running a little bit more from a coaching perspective than recruiting, because as it's cyclical on the field, recruiting is wild, right? It changes like crazy. So that adjustment on the field will feel much more familiar than it might be to look at the recruiting calendar and start sending Instagram and Twitter DMs, which, some of these coaches, Bill Belichick hadn't done before the last few months, so I think that part of it will feel more familiar and comfortable. And obviously the experience allows you to translate it and coach and teach, much more so than someone who has less. I mean, it just is what it is from that standpoint. So I like the hire. I think this is, again, we talked about it with Dan Lanning trying to replace Junior Adams a couple episodes ago. The mark of a great coach is also how he CEOs that thing and how he handles hires, because inevitably with success will come departures. People will want to pull from your program literally with some of your assistant coaches, coordinators, or all of the above. So I think this is something that Steve Sarkisian's had to deal with already, and something that's really not going to slow down for him. So you understand that those guys, they don't just see a move happen and say, oh crap, I got to make a phone call and see where we go. The list's already built. It's a rolling evaluation of coaches and new names and guys he has to vet. So I think when you do see a bit of a callback like this, it is for a reason. And it's something that maybe behind the scenes starts to get talked about a little bit longer than most people realize.
Yeah, I think it's really important. You got to be ready when you're Texas, you're going to lose a coach every year, probably multiple. But if you're not, it's worse because that means you're not achieving something.
Correct.
They don't go after, especially the NFL coaches. They're not going to go to a school that just went 5-7 and grab your DB coach or your O-line coach. They're coming for the elite school. So that's a big part of it. And Sark's done a really good job. But John, thank you very much for coming on the show today. Tell everybody where they can find your work.
Yeah, real simple. Rivals.com. New rankings coming out next week. We got a lot of camp coverage coming to your way as well. So check it out.
Appreciate it, sir. You can find the portal on all the different platforms, YouTube. You can find it on Spotify, Apple, anywhere you get your pods. I appreciate you all. Hit like, subscribe. We will see you again soon on the portal.